Hi, Misha here, and for the week of 4th of July, I thought it only fitting to focus again on U.S. aircraft, ships, what have you. And since it's been a minute, I thought we would talk about U.S. Navy torpedo bombers in World War II, primarily the TBM Avenger. Last year I showed you this model. This is the TBM-1, as flown by President George Bush in 1944. But I do have a new one. Well, new for you. This is a TBM-3 of the British Royal Navy, known as a Mark IV. This was an anti-submarine plane used in the 50s, and also pretty much the final version of the Avenger with some changes. And of course, before we talk about it, we definitely have to talk about the good old TBD-1 Devastator again, because of course we do. This model here is from SkyMax, and these two are from Hobbymaster, although to be fair, SkyMax is pretty much Hobbymaster by another name. And all three are 1/72 scale die-cast. And as I have to give this caveat at the beginning or somewhere in the videos, I am blind, so I'm doing the best to get what I can get on camera. This is just for fun. It is what it is. With that, let's talk about some American planes. Despite its honestly deserved reputation that it earned quickly in World War II, believe it or not, the TBD was the most advanced naval carrier-based bomber in the world when it went into service. It was a monowing, one of the first. It was all metal. It was the first to have an enclosed canopy cockpit, and it had semi-retracting landing gear. They were actually, the front gears left a little bit exposed in case they failed to come down. They could still do an emergency landing on them. And at the time, it wasn't super slow or anything by the standards of the day. This dates back to 1934 when the Navy ordered a new torpedo bomber for its new carriers like the Lexington and Enterprise. Lexington and Saratoga, with other carriers on the horizon like the Yorktown and Enterprise. It was designed and first flown in April of 1935, and initial testing against competition from other makers like Grumman proved that the Douglas design was quite well suited. And from there, it went for carrier trials on board Lexington and was quickly adopted for service. And it would enter service in 1937, with the production run lasting until 1939, with a total of 130 built. That sounds small, but consider the U.S. at the time had fewer than half a dozen operational carriers, and even when World War II would begin, would only have 7 operational carriers. So, torpedo bombers being big, they could only have a handful on board ship. This thing has a wingspan of 50 feet, although it did have powered folding wings, kind of a first, and it's 35 feet long, and its main armament was one 1900 some odd pound Mark 13 torpedo. Instead, it could also carry a 1,000-pound bomb, or 2 500-pound bombs, or a dozen smaller little bombs. It initially had a 30 caliber 7.62 millimeter machine gun in the front, but this was upgraded to a 50 cal. And in the rear, for defense, it had one 30 caliber machine gun. This was not updated. And that was it. 2 machine guns. It also had relatively light armor for the day. It had a crew of 3, pilot, who also manned the front gun. The bombardier torpedo man in the middle, who also was the navigator. And in the rear, you had the radio man slash tail gunner. She had a top speed of 206 miles per hour, but her cruising speed was more like 130, and to effectively launch the torpedo, she had to slow down even more to 115 miles per hour. So that was a thing. I think you can already kind of see the problem, and the U.S. Navy did too. She was already thought to be obsolete, or quickly becoming so, in 1940, and her replacement was already well underway, which would be the TBM. But when the war began on December 7, it wasn't ready yet. So they had to make do with what was labeled that year as the TBD Devastator. In December of 1941, the U.S. Navy had around 100 in service. Some had been lost through attrition. Others were used for training back home. And they were used in early 1942 to attack various islands, used as more of a conventional bomber there. For example, the Marshall Islands, the Gilberts, and Wake Island. They were also used to attack Japanese shipping. And then, of course, then they would use the torpedo. They did manage to damage the light aircraft carrier Ryuho, and the Japanese battleship Hiei, but not even close to sinking them. On March 10th, they attacked Japanese freight shipping off New Guinea and did some damage. But there already started to be problems. With the plane, maybe not so much. It was just becoming outdated because of all new technologies. But the Mark 13 torpedo, even when they were able to hit their target, would often fail to detonate. And this would lead to the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 7, when the Devastators would be used again, and they would help sink the light carrier Shoho, the first Japanese carrier to be sunk of the war. But they would fail to make any hits or do any damage on the fleet carrier, the main carrier, Mishaco. And of course, at that battle, Yorktown was damaged quite heavily and had to go back into port for emergency repairs. And she was just sort of a little bit ready in time for the Battle of Midway in June, and ready or not, the Devastators would be there too. Much has been made about their contribution on June 4 during the battle. Not to reenact it all here and now, but the fact is 41 took off from the carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, and of those, 6 returned. Yeah, this model here, I believe, is from Yorktown. Oh no, excuse me, I think it might be from Hornet. I should have looked before doing this. I apologize. Yeah, not seeing sometimes can be a drag. But anyway, one of those. But originally this was from the Coral Sea battle, this paint, but it would have been the same for Midway. They suffered from their torpedoes not working properly, from the necessary low speeds, from the lack of good armor protection, from the slow speed of the plane in general, from maneuverability. The Japanese Zeros ate them alive. They also suffered from just poor coordination from the higher-ups. Most of the Devastators arrived over their targets, the Japanese fleet carriers, without any fighter escort, so they were sitting ducks. It is worth pointing out, though, to the crew's credit, they were brave. Even when their torpedoes failed to work, many still got in close and tried to strafe the Japanese ships. And keep in mind, they only had one forward machine gun and one rear, so it wasn't like there was a lot to strafe with, but yet they did what they could. If nothing else, it kept the Japanese on their toes and caused them some delaying action, and kept their fighters down low, which made room for the dive bombers, the SBD, which I'll revisit in another video. But yeah, unfortunately the TBDs were sacrificed with very little to no material gain. Of course, in that battle, the 4 Japanese fleet carriers would be sunk. On the other hand, so would Yorktown. And again, 34 of the Devastators would be lost. Immediately after the Battle of Midway, the Devastator was pulled out of frontline service in the Pacific. They had 39 in the Pacific afterwards, and these were transferred to some squadrons in the Atlantic to operate off carriers like Ranger, which was in the Mediterranean. Most were eventually just used for training, but even there, they were retired out in 1942, later in the year, through 1943, with the final one scrapped in November of 1944. Again, with only 130 ever made, and already a good chunk of those out of action before World War II even started. Spare parts were always the thing, and this was just an old plane. It's funny to think a plane that was only introduced in 1937 was already obsolete by 1941, 42, but such was World War II. Luckily, whereas the Japanese made do with the planes they had, they were getting outdated, like the D-3A and the A-6M, the U.S. could afford to introduce new aircraft models. And luckily, at the Battle of Midway, the very first, where did I put them? TBF Avengers appeared. Now, they didn't have a major impact on that battle, but they were in production, and they would soon start to make a big mark in the war in the Pacific. So let's move on to those. Work actually began quite a ways back on this aircraft. In fact, its forerunner competed against the TBD in 1935. But work on the new model began in 1938, and it was selected in 1940 as the TBD's replacement. That spring, the U.S. Navy ordered 2 prototypes, and Grumman would first test fly one on August 7, 1941, and then in October, when the Navy started giving its aircraft names, it became the Avenger. And somewhat darkly ironically, on December 7, pretty much right when Pearl Harbor was being attacked, Grumman was showing off the new aircraft to the public and doing a ribbon cutting ceremony on the new factory they were going to be built in. They did complete the ceremony, and then they immediately put the factory on lockdown because they were worried about Japanese saboteurs. So they were hard at work getting these built. What do we have here? She's bigger, at nearly 41 feet long, with a 54-foot wingspan. It uses the same basic type of folding wing mechanism as on the F-4F Wildcat and the later F-6F Hellcat. Like the TBD, she has a crew of 3. Pilot, and then the middle seater is your radio man, bombardier, and then the back seater and the turret is, of course, a gunner, and the turret is electrically powered. It had a 50 caliber Browning machine gun, 1. Originally, it was designed with one 30 caliber machine gun in the nose, and a second manually operated 30 caliber machine gun ventrally located, so under the belly, and this was actually manned by the middle seater. He rather awkwardly bent over to use it, and it could carry the same Mark 13 torpedo. But whereas the TBD could only carry a 1,000-pound bomb, this could carry 2,000 pounds, one 2,000-pound bomb or four 500-pound bombs, and it had an internal closed bomb bay. It also had a very large yet modern radio set, something very important in the Pacific, something the Japanese sorely lacked. And while she wasn't a speed demon, at a max speed of 275 miles per hour, this was still a notable improvement over the previous model, and she had a ceiling of around 30,000 feet. She was tough, she had a big thick fuselage, she could take a beating, which is pretty much a characteristic of Grumman naval aircraft. And she was always designed for use on board carriers. She was really the largest single-engine plane in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and really the largest single-engine plane in the U.S. military in World War II, with only some things like the P-47 maybe being close to her, and other planes that were actually heavier being twin-engine. But, yeah, she wasn't especially maneuverable, but she was tough, and she could deliver a punch. And even from the beginning, she was better protected than the TBD. And full manufacturing was well underway at the beginning of 1942. The first 100 TBF-1s were ready in May and were shipped as quick as possible to the U.S. Navy. And they did arrive at Pearl Harbor, but just too late to get on board the carriers heading out for the Battle of Midway. However, the Avenger didn't miss out entirely on that battle. Half a dozen were already on Midway Island, kind of as a early field test flight, and so all 6 did participate in the battle, and honestly got shot up to hell. 5 were just shot down, and even the 6th one took a lot of damage, and one of her crew was killed and another wounded. But this really, only 6 of them in a huge brawl. And again, like I said with the TBD, air cover from fighters was pretty haphazard to say the least. But throughout the year, Grumman continued to deliver more and more, and then during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th, a flight of 24 Avengers kind of ended what the TBDs started by sinking the light carrier Ryuho. And then later on, in November, during the Guadalcanal campaign, another flight sunk the battleship Haia, one again the TBDs had damaged earlier that year, although lightly. So they started to make some headway in late 1942. By 1943, they started to equip more and more squadrons and see quite a bit of heavy use. And by 44, new and better versions were coming into service, although the second version to come in, the TBF-1C, was still the main combat torpedo bomber even in 1945. It's also worth pointing out that by 1943, Grumman was just overworked with the F-4F, and then later, of course, the F-6F, so they ended manufacturing. It was transferred to General Motors, and they would start what was known as the TBM-1, and then later the TBM-3. Same plan, same plane. In fact, everything was provided, of course, by Grumman, including prototypes and test models to teach them. And General Motors really used their experience with mass production of automobiles to set up assembly lines that were extremely efficient at turning out Avengers. So once they started producing, numbers really jumped up by 1944. and it was a very successful aircraft. These are at all the fun places, for example, the Battle of the Philippine Seas, Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Later they were sent out after Japanese carriers, although they had only modest luck. Probably quite famously in October, they were instrumental in sinking the super battleship Musashi. And then the next year, in April of 1945, they were again instrumental in sinking Yamato, her sister ship. They weren't just good for that, though. Traditional torpedo bomber roles. They started to be fitted with radar, search, and became quite effective anti-submarine, submarine killers in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. And luckily, although it was the largest plane ever thanks to the folding wings, these could operate off of the Independence-class escort carriers, and these were used to escort convoys, and flying Avengers out to look for and destroy subs. They claimed 30, both Japanese and German, during the latter half of the war, and really proved that they could be quite versatile, attacking many ground targets, not only with standard iron bombs, but also with the new aerial rockets. Now this model here, as I said, is from President George H. Bush. He was commissioned as the youngest naval aviator in history in June of 1943. He flew this, which he's kind of the one, at least I've heard him say on interviews, it handled like a truck. It's often attributed to other aviators too, but he said it on camera, so we'll give it to him. It seemed to well suit his temperament, slow and steady and effective. Unfortunately, he was shot down on September 2nd, 1944, although to his credit, he did complete his mission. He did deliver his ordnance and hit his target. But unfortunately, only he and one other crew bailed out, and of those, the other crewmen's chute failed to open, and so Bush was the only survivor, rescued by a submarine later on. Kind of interesting. They've done a couple of Bush commemorative versions of what's known as Barbara, or Barbara II, here. But the aircraft service was far from over, even at the end of hostilities. After the war, these are sometimes used as cargo freight aircraft. Some are even turned into passenger aircraft, able to carry 6 or 7 people. They were also used to search and rescue, and they continue to be used in an anti-submarine role. Now, of course, as I mentioned in the first video last year, no discussion of the Avenger is complete without talking about Flight 19 as it's known today. This was the disappearance on December 5, 1945 in the Bermuda Triangle. Also, a Catalina flying boat disappeared. It was a training cruise, much like Gilligan's Island, only meant to last a couple hours, and they never came back. So maybe they're somewhere on an island with coconut bikinis and weird pancake syrup glue. I don't know. Topic for another video, but had to mention it. While production would end, these are still very much in U.S. Navy use during the Korean War, but they were used more for secondary roles, more as their freight and patrol and whatnot duties at this point, because the jets are coming in. And then in 1955, they were finally retired out of the USN. Production would be well over 9,800, so close to 10,000 built, with the majority being from General Motors. And whereas the Devastator was only used by the U.S. Navy, the Marines didn't even use it except for one loaner. They tried out for like 2 days and said, "Nah." The Avenger was used by quite a few Allied navies and air forces, both during and after World War II. So let's look at the new model that I've not shown on camera before. This model here is an Avenger AS Mark IV of the Royal Navy, circa 1957, during the Suez Canal incident. But before we talk about it more, let's talk about a few variants. And there are a lot of variants, some that were produced, some that were only prototyped. The original Dash 1 gave way to the improved Dash 1C. It had additional fuel tanks in the wings and also could start to mount external drop tanks. And it replaced the single 30 caliber gun in the nose with two 50 caliber Brownings, one on each wing outside of the propeller arc. And while they don't seem to be standard, there are accounts of these doing rocket attacks. So it seems like they were able to carry at least some rockets. And there were, again, lots of versions, including night fighting versions and ones equipped with types of radar and stuff. And this was the most common, the TBF-1C, and then of course, once General Motors took over, it became the TBM-1. Next up would be, at least for main production, the TBM-3. It had an improved, more powerful engine. It made the wing racks standard for rockets. Had more options. And they would actually remove, at least somewhere during the production of the Dash 3, the ventral gun emplacement, the manually operated one by the middleman. I could kind of understand why, especially considering that by 1944 or 45 these are being used more and more for ground attack, and less as traditional torpedo bombers. So less emphasis on defense. So where does the Royal Navy come into play? During World War II, besides the U.S. Navy and Marines, the Avenger was used by the New Zealand Air Force as bombers, at least for a brief period of time, and quite early on by the Royal Navy. They were going to originally call it Tarpon back in 1942, but then in 43 they got smart and they started using American names just to keep things not terribly crazy. So it became the Avenger. And the original TBF-1 was the Avenger Mark I. The TBM-1 became the Avenger Mark II. And the improved TBM-3 became the Avenger Mark III. And these would be used mostly throughout 1944 and 45 in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. For example, in July of 44, a Royal Navy Avenger would shoot down a V-1 flying bomb, which is obviously a lot faster, but it was actually the tail gunner who plucked it out of the sky as it went by. And then during a raid on an oil refinery in January over in the Pacific, another Royal Navy Avenger shot down quite an advanced Japanese fighter, the Ki-44. And they would have quite a few in service, over 1,000, and keep them as such throughout the late 40s. This version here, the Mark IV, came about in 1953 as an interim, a stopgap measure, until the Fairey Gannet anti-submarine aircraft was ready. 100 were acquired. These started off as TBM-3s from the USA. It was kind of a Allied aid program. And then once transported to the UK, Scottish Aviation would install British equipment, most notably a radar set under the wing here, in that barrel-looking thing, to use these for anti-submarine patrols. And of course they would be fitted with rockets and torpedoes in case they found a sub, so they could theoretically make do. Of course, this was during the Cold War, so it was mostly just patrols. But they did deploy these in the Suez Canal, like I said, in 1957. This is off HMS Bulwark. And that was pretty much the last time the Mark IV was used. As early as 1954-55, Gannets started to come into the Fleet Air Arm, and then in 1957, these started to be given up as surplus to needs, many going to France, who would continue to use them in their campaigns in Indochina, including off their own ex-Royal Navy aircraft carrier. And as far as I understand, the last Avenger was out of British military service by 1962. A few other countries also used it, including Canada, and as I mentioned, France. But Britain was probably the biggest user outside of the United States. And I just thought this would be a neat model to go along with this one. Yeah, there it is. The George Bush plane is the earlier version with the ventral gun still. It has the earlier antennae on the underside of the wings. It you can display it with the rockets on or off, but it came with them, and it seems like by 44 it probably would have carried them. And I have it displayed with the bomb bay closed up. This one, being a -3 variant, has a few minor differences in the detailing, especially under the wings. And I decided to display this with the bomb doors open and a torpedo showing. These also come with 4 500-pound bombs if you'd rather display them that way. So you have some options. Interestingly, this one came with the rockets on the wings. I'm sure I can pry them off, but they came installed. The asymmetric radar is removable. And this is an older model. It's only like the third one Hobby Master made. And so it actually did not come with crew figures, so I just stuck some people in there. The canopy, of course, opens. The turret has some movement to it, not a great deal, but some. The propeller spins, and of course, like any Hobby Master, you can display it with wheels up or down. The newer George Bush release, which came out just about a year ago, did come with crew figures. And it too came with a torpedo, 4 bombs, and again optional rockets that you had to plug on, which were not terribly fun to do, I'm not going to lie. So now that I've got them on, I don't have a great desire to take them off. Because they're both very heavy, true die cast with very little plastic except for the small detailing. But hey, what do you expect from a 1/72 scale model of what was known as the Turkey? It was a big plane, but it was durable, effective, and that's why it outlived World War II, while so many of its contemporaries, even some introduced after, did not. So a very respectable service history, and a very respectable plane from Grumman, a maker known for naval aviation. I just felt like revisiting these. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, I hope I got something on camera for you. Love the chat in the comments below. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.